So we turn now to books 9 to 10. And what we'll be looking at is really the tales that Odysseus will tell the Phaeacians. And these are really the tales that kind of make up some of the most memorable moments of the Odyssey. So let's just take a look real quick. We have another map here. This map kind of offers a kind of general summary of all of Odysseus's travels, and let's just go through this. Some of it is included in what we'll be discussing here, and some extends into other parts and to parts that we'll be getting into. So around this area we see, which gets us into Turkey, is we have Troy. Troy is sacked, and Odysseus and his men immediately sail to Ismaris, where the Cicones are. They sack and kill the Cicones. His men kind of don't want to leave. They're enjoying the spoils. The Cicones gather more reinforcements, and unfortunately come back, and Odysseus and his men are attacked and suffer some substantial losses. So afterwards they sail off and they're all happy, well, sort of not very happy at that moment, but then the winds blow and they're blown terribly off course until they reach the land of the lotus eaters. His men don't want to leave. They start to eat this lotus, which is probably this drug. We have it here in Africa, here in northern Africa. And they don't want to leave, so they have to be forced to leave, and so they sail onward and they reach the land of the Cyclops. Polyphemus was the son of Poseidon, and he's a very unhospitable host, as we'll discuss and as you've hopefully read. So afterwards, after some terrible encounters with the Cyclops, they move on and they reach the island of Aeolia, where Aeolus, King Aeolus, offers to help them return home by by containing wind within a bag, because at that time Poseidon is kind of angry at Odysseus and his men. They've already reached the island of the Cyclops, and they've done their deeds, which we'll talk about, which has angered Poseidon, and so the winds have to be contained. Aeolus does this. They're about to sail home. They can see the shores of Ithaca, but unfortunately his men get greedy. They want to say, what's in the bag? And Odysseus hasn't told them. They open the bag and they're blown back off course, and they reach back to the king, who at that point says, look, you guys are cursed, obviously, and I'm not helping you. So at that point, facing difficulties, they have to kind of row, and they get all the way to the Lastrygonians, these cannibals who just devour and spear his men, and they really have to hightail it out of there as quickly as possible. But unfortunately, the giants throw rocks and destroy all of his ships, but the ship of Odysseus. So they sail from there to the island of Circe, a sorceress who starts to transform his men into animals, and Odysseus himself would have been transformed were it not for the help of Hermes, the messenger god, sent to help him through, of course, the aid of the others, especially Athena. Circe capitulates and helps them in the end, and she says, you need to go talk to Tiresias in the land of the dead here. So they sail there. We have what's called a Katabasis, a descent into the underworld. At least it's more of a vision on the part of Odysseus, and Tiresias, the prophet, offers him insight into what he has to do in order to get home. He tells him, listen, you need to kind of sail by these terrible rocks, avoid them as much as possible, as we see here, and then you'll get to the Scylla and the Charybdis. Actually 11 is the Charybdis here, this whirlpool, and Scylla is this monster that eats the men 6 at a time. And they sail through there, but unfortunately things turn out badly once they get to Thrinaca, where they eat the cattle of Helios, the sun god, who complains, and so the gods get angry at them, and the ship of Odysseus, before they're able to sail home, is destroyed, and Odysseus is again sent back and finds himself on the island of Calypso, who we've seen already, who falls in love with Odysseus and won't let him leave until Athena comes to his aid, and again Hermes forces her to leave him. And so he gets on his raft, he sets sail again, Poseidon works up a storm, and he reaches the Phaeacia over here, where we see King Antinous, and there he tells the tales of his voyages, which we'll get into now, and which we've seen here, after which they give him some help, and he gets home to Ithaca. And when he gets home to Ithaca, that sort of begins the second part of the work, the part of his revenge against the suitors. So let's take a look at basically some of these voyages, okay, the voyages that take place before, for the most part, he gets to Calypso, and see some of the interesting events that occur. So what I'll be doing here is I'll mostly be discussing some of the main themes. So I'll assume that you have read the books 9 to 12, in fact, because we'll be looking at 11 and 12 before you actually go through this lesson. It would be very helpful, in fact, because you'll know what I'm talking about, since I won't be summarizing all the events as they are. This was kind of just a grand summary. So some of the main characters, we have Polyphemus, King Iolaus, the Keeper of Winds. Polyphemus is a Cyclops. He has one eye, and he's the son of Poseidon. King Iolaus is the Keeper of Winds. Eurylochus is one of the mentioned, not the only one actually, this is incorrect, but he's one of the mentioned shipmates of Odysseus, and we have Circe, the goddess of Aea. Some themes that I'll talk about: Xenia, which comes from Xenos, or stranger; Metis, cunning; the Cyclops; and Circe, the Deathless God. So, Xenia. Now, this is an important concept that I want you to think about as you see some of the interactions that occur throughout the Odyssey. Xenia is what's expected of the peoples of Greece in the ancient times. You go to someone's house, even as a stranger, and they should treat you well. They should give you something to eat. And as a guest, you should be also courteous and respectful to your host. Now, again, the word here is xenos, foreigner or stranger. So we see some good examples of Xenia in the work. We see King Alcinous, who is the king of the Phaeacians, who basically gives Odysseus a new ship, and he gives him an incredible amount of wealth. In fact, he asks all the nobles from around his region to bring some prizes for Odysseus, which they do, and so he goes back home wealthier than he was after he even left Troy. So King Alcinous was a very great and gracious man, and has good Xenia. We have King Iolaus, who, of course, was at first very affable and giving. He offers a rest, he offers a feast, the gift of the wind, of containing it, at least for Odysseus. The wind here. And he only rejects him when he returns because of, unfortunately, the acts of his men. So his men, you'll see as you read the Odyssey, they constantly do things which are foolish. Occasionally, Odysseus does foolish things, but his men are really rueful and willful in this way, and they cause a lot of ill upon themselves. In any case, King Iolaus eventually rejects them and says, listen, you guys, as I said just before, must be cursed by the gods if you're back here after I gave you those winds. And indeed, in some way, Odysseus was cursed by the gods, certainly by Poseidon. Now, some bad examples of Xenia we'll see one example is Polyphemus, the Cyclops. He greets Odysseus by eating his men. Just, hi, I'm going to eat you. The Lastrygonians basically do the same thing. So notice the Cyclops is a giant sort of monster. The giants here are the same cannibals, right? And the suitors are hated by the gods, and I'll repeat that, they're hated even by the gods, and they are certainly disrespectful to their host. They show bad Xenia. And just a point here that bad Xenia will be characterized by barbarity, monstrosity, the giants, right, and Cyclops, but also by deep disrespect, which we could add here, which we see in the suitors, and a disrespectfulness even to the will of the gods, since the suitors, as we get into the books, which make really the second part of the work later, we'll see they see all these omens, and which the gods really are expected to give, and yet they ignore them. So Metis. Now what we see, this is a second, the third concept really that we've talked about, the Greek concept, the previous one here being Xenia. Now Metis is a little different, and here we have two overlapping features of Odysseus, very important features. First of all, we see that he's an extremely cunning warrior. The things that he does, the situations that he gets himself out of, shows his cunning. He's also sometimes rash, impetuous. In other words, he kind of acts sometimes too rashfully without thinking. Okay, and so this is really part of what I'll call here the hero's virtues, and I'll look at the vices as well. Now Metis in this case is cunning, or you could call it cunning intelligence, and you'll notice throughout the work that there are these various epithets which are attached to the individuals. These epithets are these characteristics used to describe the different characters in terms of their attributes or properties, who they are. And Odysseus is constantly referred to as the resourceful or the wise. Polymetis means much, having much metis, having much cunning. Metis is especially important in the way he deals with his situations, even when he returns home, the way he deals with the suitors. He hides himself. He doesn't reveal himself to anyone except for really his son. And it shows in the way he deals with the various the gods he encounters, with the king, Alcinous, the Phaeacian king, and indeed even with Polyphemus, the Cyclops, which we'll see. Now, Metis in the Odyssey is, and this is what we have to recognize here, it's a kind of deception, an overcoming of the enemy. So you should really see this within the context of, for example, later notions of virtue, where we have the virtuous person is a humble person, the virtuous person serves others, the virtuous person is loving. Well, this is not quite the idea of the virtuous person within ancient times. So in ancient times, the virtuous person can be proud, and they can be proud because of their own noble qualities and the recognition of their own nobility. There's an arrogance there, evidently. The virtuous person has a deceptive ability. Now, that doesn't mean that they are fundamentally untruthful, right? They don't lie to their loved ones, but they will conceal their intentions when strategy dictates, and they certainly will deceive and lie to the enemy, who is certainly trying to do them harm. And so a true hero, the virtues of a hero, will have the qualities of cunning, strategic, like a general, here the Greek general strategos, strategy, strategic intelligence, resourcefulness, in other words, the ability to look at a situation which may appear disadvantageous and obtain something advantageous from it. These would be the hero's virtues. And we see that, and when we talk about the Cyclops, we see that really Odysseus shows Metis when he overcomes the giant and devises a way out of the cave, which, as you'll read, it's quite clever, and it's a quite clever idea within the tradition. He responds to the Cyclops, who asks, "Who is it that is in this cave? What's your name?" And he says, "Utis, I am no one." That's my name, Metis, no mortal. And so this will be important for the way in which allows them to escape. Some of the vices of Odysseus, which you might start to notice, is he's very war-hardened. You'll see this especially, and you want to be careful, or you want to take your time as you read through some of these parts. The initial assault upon Ismaris in his tales, where he attacks the Cicones. You'll notice within in the book that it's mentioned by Homer as a kind of offhanded affair. Oh, and by the way, we stopped by Ismaris, and there was the Cicones stronghold. What did we do? Well, we attacked it. We razed it to the ground. In other words, we destroyed it. We killed all the men, and we enslaved the women and children. And this is Odysseus then says, and then unfortunately my men didn't want to leave. They were having too much fun, and the Cicones came back with reinforcements, and then we were unhappy. And you can imagine the Phaeacians who are listening to the tale start to sigh, oh, how terrible. Notice nobody sighs, though, at the fact that what they had done to the Cicones was terrible. Why? Because these men, the Mycenaean age, these are war-hardened men and women, individuals used to this type of behavior. And indeed, in some ways, the Mycenaeans are this kind of pirate culture too. So there's this, deep, let's say, habit of culture which has kind of been born in the practice of bloodshed and war. And so this becomes the character's vices, really. If you really look at it truly, it's vicious in many ways. It's a barbarity. So Odysseus is often too curious. He goes to the cave of the Cyclops, this massive cave with these massive bowls and cups, and he waits. He says, I want to see who lives here. That was a big mistake, which almost led to the loss of his life and the loss of all of the lives of his men, and certainly of some of them. He's also curious again later on in the work. They pass by these sirens, these mystical women that are kind of like birds and women who sing this song that draw the ships to the rocks. And when you listen to the song, you cannot but want to hear more of it. And so he's warned of this, he and his men. I believe it was by Circe, which we'll see later. And he says to his men, tie me to the mast so I can hear the song, and you can all put some wax in your ears. So and he suffers on account of it. So he's sort of very curious. There's a little bit of cowardice, perhaps. I'm not sure if this is right, but when you read the part where the Laestrygonians destroy all of his ships, you see that Odysseus really hightails it out of there very quickly. Now, maybe that's just kind of the only move he could make, but he does kind of abandon them. There's perhaps nothing he could have done. He's certainly arrogant. He reveals his name to the Cyclops. The arrogance there is with a question mark. And I'll talk about this in a bit, but really it's a foolishness, but perhaps not arrogant. It's foolish because in the end it leads to the Cyclops praying to his father to revenge what Odysseus has done to him. So that makes it kind of a foolishness. Is it arrogant? I'm not sure. We'll have to see. And then we have this mutiny which constantly occurs where he has a hard time dealing with his sailors. Eurylochus, one of his sailors, is constantly questioning him. So he has his vices. He's not perfect. Again, he's just a mortal man. So let's talk a bit about the Cyclops. Now, they enter the cave, and I'm sure if you've read it, you know what happened. But I'll tell the tale briefly. Let me just make sure. We'll talk about that in a second. So they land on the shore of the Cyclops, and they see a great cave. They go looking for food. In the cave, there's some sheep. And he says, I don't want to leave the cave. I want to see what's in this cave. And unfortunately, a giant cyclopean, basically creature comes in, sees them, and he immediately takes one of the men and eats the men, tears the men apart, and puts a huge rock at the entrance, trapping them in. So eventually they need to get out, after the Cyclops continues to eat them, they make a ruse where they get the Cyclops drunk, and as he's sleeping, they take a spear and pierce him in the eye. And eventually the Cyclops, of course, awakens from this, and they hide beneath the sheep. He opens the rock wall, and they escape through the sheep. They run to the ships as the blind Cyclops tries to find them. They get on the ships, the Cyclops, and when they're on the ships, Odysseus starts to shout and to taunt the Cyclops, who is blind, which puts the men in danger because, well, as I say here, he risks having his ships hit by another rock. So he's shouting at the Cyclops, and finally he reveals his true name, because at first, in order to get out, he says, "I am no one," when the Cyclops asks his name. And, of course, the Cyclops, who had been blinded, calls out to his other fellow Cyclops for help, and they say, "What has happened? Who has done this to you?" And there, as we say, Odysseus says, "Utis, no one," which also means no mortal has done this. And so they think, oh, well, no man or person has done this, something divine has happened, and so they don't help him. Now, eventually, Odysseus does reveal his true name. And again, was it arrogance in doing so? Perhaps. But at the same time, you can imagine being in this cave, and this beast of a man-like thing, human-like thing, is eating your comrades. You would be incensed, you would be angered to the core at the injustice of it. And so Odysseus reveals his name because the need for retribution and revenge requires that the Cyclops, Polyphemus, which is his name, knows who did it to him. And I think this is really the reason that he reveals his name. Unfortunately, Polyphemus is the son of Poseidon. He prays to his father, and he is able to give the name, "Odysseus did it to me," and this causes great woes for Odysseus, which will basically leave him out to sea for another 9 years. So this tale of the Cyclops is actually deeply embedded in folklore. We see, and usually it's the same kind of theme. We see a hero and companions imprisoned. The companions are cooked by the giant on a spit over the fire, which is what the giant does. And he falls asleep. Of course, they give him wine. And the heroes take the spit, plunge it into his eye, and they escape clinging. And the Cyclops locates the hero using a magic ring. This is not in our story. In fact, in this case, the Cyclops locates Odysseus because Odysseus is shouting at him and taunting him. And the hero escapes by cutting off his finger. That's wrong. His finger. And in this case, he escapes really by luck. All right? So, but this is sort of embedded in folklore, and there's various stories that you can find if you search. So again, Homer's version: he eats the men raw. Oops, yes, he eats the men raw. And Odysseus puts him to sleep. He gives him wine. He calls himself nobody to trick him. And he's only located again when he taunts him. And again, the 3 important points here, why Homer is doing this. They show the brutality of the Cyclops. They show his lack of Xenia, very important. And the 3 Greek concepts, which I would like you to learn here, of Xenia, Metis, and Kleos. So first of all, he shows he's a bad host, terrible host. Second, they help to emphasize the cunning of Odysseus. And third, it continues this theme of Kleos, because remember, Odysseus is telling the tale to the Phaeacians. And so he's kind of showing, look, this is what happened. This is what I did. Okay, these are this is kind of my virtues, my nobility is revealed in this. So now we turn to Circe, the Deathless God. So now, eventually, we see that Odysseus, okay, after a number of travails, seeing with King Iolaus, after the Cyclops, of course, and the Laestrygonians who destroy his ships, okay, except for his own. He ends up on the shores of Circe. They get offshore, they look for food, as usual, and the men find their way up to Circe's kind of palace. And this woman is a sorceress, and she starts to give each of the men a drink which transforms them into an animal. Odysseus goes to find them, and Hermes gives him an antidote to the poison, which he drinks. And he drinks Circe's brew. He's not transformed, and the goddess then wonders what happens. He grabs his sword to kill her, and she asks, "Please have mercy on me." And he says, "Well, then help us." So eventually she does, and she indeed helps him in a very multiple ways, as you'll see when you read the story. Now, there's some interesting questions about the ancient gods, because they stand in contrast to something like the Judeo-Christian God. Okay, so are the gods good? And here we see Circe as a kind of example. She transforms them into animals. She stops only when, for example, she's forced to. She practices deception, sorcery, and there's a maliciousness to them. And interestingly, she's not really deathless, is she? Even though she's immortal, she fears being killed by Odysseus. Afterwards, there's weeping. We see Poseidon, for example, as another example of hatred. We see Zeus in other tales, the king of the gods, who has anger, jealousy, even lust. There's tales of Zeus, the great king god, raping women. So what's interesting is that the ancient gods are like us, like human beings. The difference is that they kind of human beings which are kind of given a dramatic twist. They're these kind of the superheroes in ways. You can see it that way. These are the gods, or the kind of superheroes that we see today are like those gods. And you can even look at it within the medieval world, which we'll look at later, because we have the sort of the angels and the demons, or kind of the gods of the ancient worlds, become these kind of angelic creatures in the Christian world. So we turn now to books 11 and 12, and within these books we will have what's called in literature, especially ancient literature, the Katabasis, which is the descent into the underworld. Some of the main characters here we'll see are Elpenor, who is a shipmate of Odysseus who dies after a fall, kind of a minor character, but some significance. Anticlea, who is also a ghost, Odysseus' mother he'll encounter in the underworld, so she'll have died. Tiresias, the Theban prophet that they need to consult, that Circe tells them to go and consult. And Lampetia, who is the daughter of Helios, who is not going to be in the underworld, but will play a part in some of the travails that they'll suffer. And some of the other ghosts are heroes and the heroines, and some of the condemned, which will be of some significance, especially when we get into the medieval world, because we'll be talking about hell, and especially in relation to Dante's Inferno. So some of the main events and themes here, again, the first is the Katabasis. Second, we have the Sirens, which we've spoken of briefly. And we have the Scylla and the Charybdis, and the cattle of Helios. So the Katabasis, kata in Greek means down, and beno is to go. So obviously it means a descent, and in this case a descent into the underworld, which is in Christianized to mean hell. Now you should understand that the underworld here is not hell in the sense in which we think of it. It's simply the place where the dead reside. So it's just like another earth, but it's just under the earth, and it's for the dead. Now there are certain places where those who have been evil will go, And that's kind of like the hell that we are familiar with. But the underworld itself is just kind of this place of the dead. Now, it's depicted in multiple cultures, this notion of a descent, right? There's the Greek, of course, then the Romans kind of copy the Greeks a bit. The Sumerian Epic of Gilgamesh, a small epic. There's the Egyptian, the Christian. We see that Christ descends into the dead. And the Norse, the Chinese, the Japanese, the Mayan, Hindu. And in the ancient Greek and Roman literature, what's of significance, we have the descent in the Odyssey, Odysseus, in Ovid's Metamorphoses, the descent of gods and heroes, and in Virgil, okay, the great Latin poet, Roman poet, the Aeneid, Aeneas, that has a very an interesting descent, which he kind of takes from Homer, but then develops it even further. So let's take a look at some of this here. This is Aeneas, in fact, and here we have Odysseus. And let's look at Odysseus. So Odysseus travels to the land of the underworld, and he moves basically to a portion of it, but he doesn't really get inside of it, and he has more of a vision, and he sees some of the unburied souls, some of the souls there. Aeneas, in Virgil, will in fact go all the way through hell and have a really deep voyage into the nether parts. Okay, so Odysseus is not really descending so much as he's coming sort of to the entrance for the most part, and he is having a vision where he meets the Theban prophet. So here's an interesting sort of point of mythology. So within the Greek literature and beliefs, in fact the religious beliefs, ancient Greek beliefs, when a person died, first they would be greeted by Hermes, the messenger god, who would lead the soul to the entrance of the underworld, where there would be these 5 rivers, the Acheron, woe, Cocytus or Cocytis, lamentation, phlegethon, fire, Styx, hate, and Lethe, forgetfulness. At that point, Charon, or Charon, the boatman, would wait to carry the soul across to the other side. Now, the soul needs a coin, and so what would happen is that at death, the ancients would place a coin on the lips, and this was meant for the boat ride. You have to pay the boatman. If you didn't have a coin, you would be stuck pretty much at the entrance. Your spirit would be stuck, and so you'd be stuck between earth and the underworld for eternity. And so it was very important to be properly buried in the ancient Greek cultural ideas, or ancient Greek culture. So after the ride, they would reach the gates, and there would be this 3-headed dog, Cerberus. And he would have this dragon's tail, and he would be actually very nice to you when you first entered the gates, maybe growling a bit, but nice. But he would not let you leave. So this is the first part, and then the second, the soul will then appear before these judges, some of whom will appear in Dante's Inferno. We have in different guises, in fact. We have Rhadamanthus, Minos, and Iacchus. They make a judgment, and the good souls are sent to the Elysian fields, which is a kind of heaven. It's just a nice place for the good souls to hang out. And the bad souls are sent, and indeed tossed, into the Tartarus, this great abyss. Some are given special punishments, which are mentioned by Homer and later poets. And Tartarus is also where the Titans, the fathers and mothers of the Olympian gods, who fought a war with the Olympian gods, their sons and daughters, and lost, and are imprisoned and chained. So they're chained in Tartarus. And Kronos, who's the father of Zeus, apparently reigns there, kind of in this. This would be kind of more like the hell that we're familiar with, is Tartarus. And indeed, when we look at Dante's Inferno, we're going to see that, well, Tartarus, the Inferno is basically Tartarus. So some of the punishments worth noting, and we're going to have a lot of time to talk about punishments, especially when we get to Dante. So these are mentioned by Homer, some visions of of Odysseus. We have Tantalus, is now seen here. He offered his son Pelops as a sacrifice and meal to the gods. Pretty nasty, right? And he's punished by being placed in a pool of water eternally with fruit just above his reach. And so you can imagine the soul hungers for the fruit eternally before his eyes and can never touch it. So a kind of a interesting punishment that fits the sin. We're going to see this also in Dante. We have Tityus, a giant who attempts to rape the goddess Lino, really at the behest of Athena, who was angered at this woman, because Zeus had basically had relations with her, and he's punished by being stretched out and having 2 vultures eat his liver, which grows back each time. And finally, there's Sisyphus, who's betrayed one of Zeus's secrets by revealing the island of Aegina, and he's punished to roll a boulder up a steep hill, at which point it falls back down. So now we're going to talk a bit about what Odysseus is told to do in order to speak, to obtain the vision where he could see the ghosts at the entrance of the underworld. And Circe's instructions, okay, given in Book 10, are to dig a trench and to pour libations of milk, honey, and wine, and then to vow to the dead to slaughter a heifer, to them upon your return to Ithaca, and to Tiresias, okay, the Theban prophet, a ram. The dead will appear. You need to slaughter and flay the sheep, but don't let the ghosts come near the blood until you have questioned Tiresias. So what's interesting here is this notion of sacrifice, right? And I think it's something that you need to really reflect upon, is this, notice this need of the dead for blood, right? And also this notion of sacrifice. It certainly plays a part within the Western Judeo-Christian religions. Okay, we see a notion of sacrifice in the tale of Abraham and Isaac in the Old Testament. We see the notion of sacrifice is fundamental to Christianity, where Christ is the Lamb of God who was sacrificed for the sins of humanity. And I think this is something interesting because it appears in virtually every religion that one encounters, and we see it here. Even the kind of the process, the ritualistic process, is kind of discussed, and it's very interesting to see it kind of from an anthropological point of view, to see and to read that part and to notice that she's actually talking about something that would have been done in ancient times in ancient Greece. Then we have the Sirens, who I did speak about already. And the Sirens, again, were these bird-like creatures, and they also occur in various myths in different guises, and sometimes they look more like women and sometimes more like birds. Sometimes they have the heads of birds. It's various caricatures of them. So we could talk about that. What do the Sirens symbolize? And it's an interesting consideration. And one possible response is that they symbolize, especially if we Christianize it, which, because of course we'll be looking at Dante, they symbolize something like temptation, and the temptations to various vices that we could actually be called to, and that where it's perhaps fundamentally too, as they're women, in this case in Odysseus and his men, perhaps the call of lust and sexual desire as one possible temptation, but not only the call to violence, the call to do harm to others can be another type of temptation. The call, for example, to revenge. So there's various different symbolizations which we can obtain for the Sirens themselves, but they kind of just appear quickly throughout in the book. And then there's the Scylla and the Charybdis, which we see is located here between Sicily and in this small opening here, right, and Messina. And now the Scylla and the Charybdis are these kind of mythological creatures that are presented within the context of Homer's Odyssey. You can imagine that in actual history, this was perhaps a point which was maybe difficult to pass through, and that it's possible that ships often shipwrecked in this area, and so it became maybe mythologized in the sense that there's these creatures in this whirlpool, and there was probably these problems that sailors would encounter. And you have to remember that there's no digital recording or audio or video. There's just kind of, the word of individuals who saw things and perhaps thought they saw things and maybe didn't see them as well, or just kind of changed the stories, or also the stories change as they change, as it were, hands, right? So we have these different stories which could lead to these beastly creatures, and I think it's an interesting story which kind of imparts the image in one's memory and the horrors of it. So it'll be fun as you read through that. So there's the cattle of Helios here. And so what happens is, really, they're kind of on their way possibly home, and the sailors again do a foolish thing. They land on an island and they eat the cattle, even though they're warned explicitly not to eat the cattle. So they fulfill the events foretold in the proem. This is very interesting. The recklessness of their own ways destroyed them all. The blind fools, they devoured the cattle of the sun. So Odysseus does not, and so he lives. And this shows a contrast with Odysseus, that should be Kleos, so that Odysseus has this noble character, also his Metis is cunning, but his Kleos, this kind of respectability, that the sailors really, they're not quite noble as Odysseus, and they constantly fall into these foolish ways. And also it leaves Odysseus isolated. This is important, and it's really kind of a literary device, because after the sailors eat the cattle of the sun, and they're forbidden to do so, they eat the sun god's cattle on an island, and they're finally destroyed because Lampetia complains about this, and the gods are angered. And so it leaves Odysseus alone so that he can be alone with Calypso finally on the island with her, and then eventually he will have to fight it out on his own when he returns to Ithaca. And indeed, it also foreshadows the suitors and their fate. For just as the sailors are foolish in their ways and they disrespect the gods directly because they're warned of this, so to the suitors, who are given constant warnings both through Telemachus and even through some prophets that we'll see later on and prophecies, they ignore this, and so their fate is to be destroyed just as the sailors of Odysseus.